I'm Kevin Martin. I'm the organizer of the Greater Boston NLP and Hypnosis Meetup. I want to welcome you. Our speaker, David Shiang, is going to be speaking to us on Transcending Mindfulness. I'll introduce David in just a moment. I want to talk about the Greater Boston NLP and Hypnosis Meetup. We are a personal development meetup. We are the largest of its kind in New England as far as NLP and hypnosis, but we don't just have topics on NLP and hypnosis. It turns out there's a lot of personal development type of modalities out there that actually kind of, are part NLP, part hypnosis sometimes. So I bring a lot of speakers in here to talk about various things. And tonight I'm really excited. It doesn't get more exciting and even more mystifying than Transcending Mindfulness, how to break on through with Jim Morrison, Albert Einstein, in the shockingly simple solution of the quantum enigma. Jim Morrison and Albert Einstein, I think might have attracted a lot of you here tonight. And I appreciate it. It attracted me as well. I am excited and anxious to hear this. And it's going to be wonderful. And that little piece there, the quantum enigma. He's got a couple of books that he's got pictures of right up here. And one of them is called the quantum enigma. So a lot of things in quantum mechanics that actually translate into, how we act as human beings, how things happen for us in our lives. And I think we're going to see a little bit of that connection tonight. So without further ado, I want to introduce David. David and I met through a local networking group. And I had actually met a partner of his out in Canada through another networking group. So when I met David in this networking group, I said it's meant for us to know each other. Things like that happen. And David is a graduate of MIT, has a Master of Management from Kellogg School of Northwest University. He was also a Danforth Fellow in English PhD program at UC Berkeley. All over the place. He is a managing director of WIFM Sales, W-I-I-F-M Sales, and marketing. W-I-I-F-M, what's in it for me? For those of you that are speakers and trainers, specializing in helping clients make quantum leaps in their businesses and personal lives. He began teaching marketing in 1989, has worked with clients such as J. Abraham Group, DuPont, Chase, Microsoft, IBM, Dell, and HP. He co-hosted a 3-day entrepreneurial marketing summit in Florida, and he is the author of 6 books on subjects ranging from Einstein and the quantum theory to Jim Morrison and the Doors. Before I bring them on, I want to ask you to all stay muted. You're going to use your chats for any questions. Use the chat to everyone for any questions that you have. And I'll be telling him when it's time, I'll be stating that to bringing those questions to David. Okay, you can keep your pictures on and pictures off. David's not going to be paying attention to any pictures. He's just going to go and talk to us. Without any further ado, David Shiang.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. I appreciate it. Before we begin, if you could put 2 numbers into the chat. One is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar are you with the Doors? And the second number is, how familiar are you with quantum theory and Einstein? So just put 2 numbers in, and I'll check those out, and we'll get rolling. So this presentation is about transcending mindfulness, and as Kevin said, it's about Jim Morrison, Albert Einstein, and quantum theory. So I am going to present some solutions this evening, but I want to set the stage because we are in an era of unprecedented uncertainty and confusion, and it means all you have to do is watch the news, and this is been going on since March, if not earlier, and you can see these words. I mean, people are very, very anxious. They're depressed. They're traumatized. And a lot of it has to do with the loss of control and the loss of power. And we want to escape. So addiction is up, divorce is up, all kinds of negative things are up. And I'm going to suggest that Jim Morrison and Albert Einstein had solutions to this problem. And they're not here anymore, and they didn't anticipate this, but I think they have a lot to contribute here, as well as T.S. Eliot. We're going to talk about him just a little bit. So if you talk about Einstein, you know that he was considered, one of the world's leading geniuses. And Time magazine in 1999, they chose a person of the century, and they, polled all these experts, and they chose Albert Einstein. Now, if you know the history of quantum theory, Einstein made major contributions in the early 1900s, but then he largely abandoned quantum theory in 1927, 1928, 1929, when Niels Bohr and the Young Turks took over. Young Turks being Dirac, Heisenberg, a few others, and they are known as the founders of quantum theory. And Einstein never accepted it. And in '52, he said, "This theory reminds me a little of the system of delusions of an exceedingly intelligent paranoiac, concocted of incoherent elements of thoughts." And if you know anything about Einstein, he is attributed with saying all kinds of comments that he probably didn't say, one of which could be the thing about doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is a form of insanity. He probably never said that. I actually have a book of quotes of Einstein. There's a section in there saying quotes attributed to Einstein that he probably didn't say. But, and I've met people who literally told me Einstein, towards the end of his life, accepted quantum theory. He gave in to randomness and chance. And that's absolutely ridiculous, okay? And we're going to see that there's a lot of ridiculous things being said about quantum theory, not only by scientists, but also by lay people. But this was written 3 years before he died. He sent a letter to this fellow and basically expressed his lifelong views. So let's not forget, I mean, the guy was a genius, didn't accept quantum theory. Now, I'm going to deliver one word later that is all about freedom. And that word, it comes from physics, but there's a non-physics equivalent, which is 3 words, and it solves the problem of past, present, and future. And this way of seeing the world is entirely logical, and it's full of paradox. And I have said to people, it's the solution everybody wants, but nobody likes. So let's start by talking about mindfulness. And I'm sure you know, I mean, lately mindfulness has gotten tremendous pull and attraction. And I mean, I've been tracking mindfulness. I started meditating 49 years ago. So I've been tracking this for a long time. And mindfulness recently, there's magazines on mindfulness and soul and spirit. And I mean, there's literally an explosion in this whole thing. So there are many benefits, reduce anxiety, lower stress, and this is all very good. I'm all in favor of mindfulness, but I think it's incomplete in a sense because it doesn't really solve the problem of regret and anxiety, the problems of regret and anxiety. And if you look at people who talk about mindfulness is about being present. Mindfulness is about being still. Mindfulness is about being, in the flow, in the moment. And you're getting rid of all that stuff that's cluttering up your mind. It's decluttering. The problem is that when you've emptied your mind, what fills it up? What comes after the silence? You've probably seen these ads on TV. Calm, be calm for 15 seconds. I actually had a 35-second, a 30-second one, and a 15-second one. So, what happens after that? You go back to being all upset and worried and anxious and, whatever. So the fastest way that I know to solve that problem is through the Doors, through their music. And I asked you to put in those numbers, and some of you put in 1 and some of you put in 5. The Doors, hopefully you know who they are. It doesn't mean you have to listen to their music or like their music, but they're out there and they've been around for over 50 years. So I view the music as an escape to reality, not an escape from reality. And I see it as a portal into the unknown. And it's a psychological, spiritual thrill ride, and it's music that heals. So on the left is a book that I wrote called Jim Morrison and the Secret Gold Mine, and I look at the lyrics. I'm from a literary background, and I'm a critic in that book. So Jim Morrison was a very complex figure. Lots of things are going on, and I like the line at the very bottom that he was considered the most Shakespearean of all rock and rollers. In the way the music came across, in the lyrics, there's a lot of Lear-like rage. There's a lot of probing of emotions, and I think a lot of critics have really missed that. Now, this was written by a guy calling himself the Traveling Professor in 2010, when Jim Morrison was being pardoned for an offense he probably did not commit in Miami in 1969. So this professor says, you can read it, but in my college class, if I ask students who is James Dean, Judy Garland, Timothy Leary, even Frank Sinatra, they have no idea, but they all know Jim Morrison. And I love the last part. When I mentioned Paul McCartney, one student said, wasn't he in a band called Wings? So the Doors are still very popular. On the left is a tall wall that was hanging off the side of a 12-story building in West Hollywood during the summer of 2012, when the Doors were celebrated at the Sunset Strip Music Festival, and over 75 bands played over 3 days, and I assume they all played at least one Doors song. I went out there for that event. Ray Manzarek, I met Ray and John and Robbie in 1972 because they came to Boston, and I called the promoter and said, I'm working on a book on the Doors. Can I get a backstage pass? And the guy said yes. And so I met the 3 Doors in 72, and then I kept in touch with Ray, and he got me a pass to a private party at this Sunset Strip Music Festival. And now every January 4th in LA, it's called the Day of the Doors. They started that in 2017 on the anniversary of the release of the first album. So people wonder, what's Jim Morrison all about? And he made a few statements that are sort of interesting, but one is about the known and the unknown. And this is quoted quite often. Things known and things unknown, and in between are the doors. And if my poetry aims to achieve anything, is to deliver people from the limited ways in which they see and feel. So that's what he's trying to do in his music. And so they exploded on the scene in '67, and you can look at what a couple writers have said. The first is about the Doors playing some secret frequency of pleasure and the smile center of the brain. The second one I think is really important because this Newsweek reporter said, they come out on stage not to entertain but to preach, with all the disdain and cold fury of a revivalist preacher confronting an audience wallowing in sin. And Jim Morrison often preached at his audience. He berated his audience. He called them nasty words. And there was, when they were performing over 5 years, basically there was a tug of war that developed between the audience and the group. because a lot of kids did not want to hear the serious music. They just wanted to hear Light My Fire over and over, which Jim Morrison did not write, by the way. So, as I said, they were interpreted by the vast majority of critics. And Timothy White, who Rock Lives, he was the editor of Billboard magazine. He's passed away, but you know, the bulk of Morrison's opaquely platitudinous lyrics with chuckleheaded wordsmen, I mean, that is so absurd. So my book, I look at what Timothy White was saying, but I look at the lyrics in order to show there's real depth and complexity there. But it's not just pretty poetry. Jim Morrison's lyrics had an intention, and he talks about that, and I'll get to that later. So this is a book, and I'm holding it up. It's by a guy named Greil Marcus. If the music with which the Doors announced themselves said anything, it said it wasn't kidding. Seriousness of intent, thrilling in its own terms. So I have been following Greil Marcus. He was actually a writer for Rolling Stone way back in the 60s. And I've been following him for, since then, basically. And I met him, I went and interviewed him in Cambridge when he brought this book out in 2011. And it says, a lifetime of listening to 5 mean years. And I wrote in my book that his understanding of the Doors would barely fill a thimble. And I sent him the cover for my book, and he actually responded. I mean, he has no clue what's going on. I don't know if he's gotten, any wiser or has any more insight now, but he literally has been listening to it. He said he had listened to the first album hundreds and hundreds of times. And so if somebody like that can listen for a whole lifetime and not have a clue, then a lot of other people are in the same boat. Now, the Doors were covered by what's called the A-list. So they emerged from the rock and roll magazines to people like Vogue and Saturday Evening Post, and so this guy Kurt von Meer had discovered it. So this quote is from a guy named Bernard Wolfe. So Kurt von Meer had discovered in him suggestions of sex, death, and transcendence. Which did he have in mind? Sex through death or death through sex? So Morrison said to him, the first on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the second on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Now, those themes, sex and death, are very often considered to be the Doors' most important themes, which that's really not quite correct. I mean, what Jim Morrison was really interested in was transcendence and getting beyond sex and death. And that's what The End is about. We'll cover that in a minute, the song, The End. So Gene Youngblood wrote an article in the Los Angeles Free Press in '67, in which he said Doors can provide instant enlightenment through sex. And this is the book that this was quoted in. And it said that the Doors were looking at all the press clippings, and Jim Morrison started reading this particular article by Gene Youngblood and sat up straight, in the studio when they were reading that clip. And for months afterward, Jim said that this writer was the first to really see where his head was at. Now, that's not, this quote, instant enlightenment through sex, is not really accurate, but what the Doors are trying to do is to provide instant enlightenment through music and maybe through eros in a eros in a very grand sense. So here's a couple. Here are a few lyrics. Take a journey to the bright midnight and wake up. Change your weather, change your luck, and a few others. So I'm going to just play a little bit of music. Hopefully you can hear it. Now here's some more, and basically. This first one, dance on fire as it intends, music is your only friend until the end. So So Jim Morrison is basically saying the music has its own intentions. Dance on fire as it intends. And he talks about when the music's over, turn out the lights. And for the music is your special friend, dance on fire as it intends, music is your only friend until the end. Now, this other one from the Wasp, I love the friends I've gathered together on this thin raft. We have constructed pyramids in honor of our escaping. So that's the escape. The music, Jim Morrison has escaped, and the music is trying to help you escape. Now, we're going to move on to quantum theory. And as I was showing you earlier, Einstein never bought into quantum theory. And so on the left is a book that I wrote called God Does Not Play Dice. And I talk about Einstein, who never really accepted quantum theory. And his big phrase was God does not play dice. Einstein's known for two things. God does not play dice, and E equals MC squared. And the vast majority of scientists will tell you we live in a world of quantum probabilities. We live in a world of randomness and chance and happenstance. Einstein never accepted that. So I'm going to introduce Mr. Whipple right now because I am nominating him as the patron saint of probability. And I was thinking of writing to the Pope about this, to petition the Pope to make Mr. Whipple a patron saint of probability. I actually sent a copy of my book to the Archbishop of Vienna a while back, Cardinal Schönbrunn, and his assistant wrote me back. But if you remember Mr. Whipple, he loved softness, and he was a character in over 500 commercials. And the big line was "Don't squeeze the Charmin." So he would go into the supermarket. I mean, he was a clerk in a supermarket, and these ladies would go squeeze the Charmin, and he would go admonish them. Then he would go around the corner and squeeze it himself. And he was a self-aware hypocrite. Now I'm bringing up softness because we're going to see that that's really at the heart of probability theory. So as I was saying, chance, randomness, and luck are inherited from the ancients. We talk about chance events, and we talk about randomness, and you meet somebody halfway around the world that lives in your hometown and you didn't know they were there, and you call that randomness. Apple had this ad, "Life is random." It's the opposite of what we call law and order. Now, it turns out that in 1654 was a very pivotal moment in math and in the world at large in terms of the quote-unquote discovery of probability. And it happened in a letter that Pascal wrote to Fermat. And you may remember Pascal from Pascal's triangle. So I'm holding up this book by a fellow named Keith Devlin, he's like the math guy on NPR. He's a professor emeritus at Stanford. And in this book, he says Pascal's letter showed how to predict the future by calculating the numerical likelihood of a particular event's happening. He showed us how to manage the future, his manage risk. His letter created our modern view of the future. And that may be true, but it turns out that the whole worldview behind here is based on what might have been. And it's very clear from reading this book, plus thinking about it. But I just want to read something from Devlin. Today, we are so used to the idea that the future comes with probabilities, the chance that it will rain tomorrow, that house prices will rise over the coming months, that an individual will die within the next 5 years, or that terrorists will attack the Los Angeles airport, that it's hard to imagine life being any other way. well, I can imagine life being a completely different way. What they're doing, what Pascal and Fermat and probability people are doing is saying, basically, okay, we know that, 1,000 people will fall down from their bikes in a certain period of time in the next year. So we take that 1,000 and we divide it by the number of people, and so everybody carries the risk of falling down. Now that is not scientific. That is what you call math. Okay, and so we're going to look at like the dice game in a second. But Richard Feynman, we're going to talk a little bit about him. He is a major physicist who wrote. Well, he taught at Caltech, and he has these very famous lectures, Feynman lectures on physics. And he said that probability is math and science, but it turns out it's not science, it's math. And it's not science because it cannot be tested. So when you toss a coin, you will get one of 6 events. Or when you toss a die, like you take this die that I have and you toss it, you're going to get a coin is 1 out of 2, but a die is 1 out of 6. So let's just say you toss it and you get a 1. The probability people say you could have gotten a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. You had a 1/6 chance of getting this, but you could have gotten something else. However, every event happens only once. And the idea that you could have gotten something else is pure assumption that cannot be tested. Therefore, probability thinking is not science. And this is what you would call a non-trivial issue. The words trivial and non-trivial are used at MIT, where I went, all the time. People talk, the humanities are considered sort of a joke by many people at MIT. Physics is supreme. It's the number one. Physicists are revered over everybody else as far as intellectual capacity. But what they're involved in terms of probability is not science. It's not physics at all. It's actually math and philosophy. So I mentioned softness and Mr. Ripple. So Charmin still around. We're going to look at the softness now. Now counterfactual definiteness is a term out of philosophy that talks about what might have happened if. And I was on a call the other day with somebody who said, what would have happened if, women had gotten the right to vote earlier? What would have happened if? This is how we think, most of us. What would have happened if I had done something else? What I'm going to say is we could not have done otherwise, but we'll get to that. But this is soft thinking. I could have done otherwise is not supported by the reality. The reality is I didn't do otherwise. So philosophers understand counterfactual definiteness very well, and some physicists do too. A guy named Nick Herbert talks about this extensively, but most scientists don't. They think, oh, I could have, I tossed a coin, I got heads, but I could have gotten tails. And there's a very well-known physicist who tells us that the most certainty we can have is 50%, because when it comes down to a coin toss, you don't know what's going to happen. The physicist says both results are equally likely. So they come up with this hypothesis that turns out to be total assumption. They turn it into a fact. Now, counterfactual thinking is wishful thinking. So this guy Tetlock, at the very bottom you can see his name, Philip Tetlock. He's made a career out of counterfactual definiteness and what might have been. So we didn't see Donald Trump, but we could have. Now this idea that we could have seen Donald Trump coming, it's a feel good, I could have done this, but I didn't do it. And it's like a power play in a way. And there's a lot of ego there. We're going to get into that in a minute. But you would not believe how many people it's like, well, I could have done this. Marlon Brando, I could have been a contender. You could have had a VA. I could have been an Oscar Mayer Wiener. The whole coulda, woulda, shoulda is omnipresent in how we think, and we're gonna the kind of word that I'm talking about, and what Einstein believed also, will eliminate this whole coulda, shoulda, woulda. Now that's easier said than done, but it still can eliminate it. So luck is everywhere in science, and what I'm saying eliminates luck also. And that's the part about, you know, it's too good to be true, yet it's too bad to be true. So when you get to win probability, this is from a guy named Nate Silver. And Nate Silver, he's got a website called 538. He wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise, which is a very interesting book. And I think this is absolutely fascinating, this win probability. You know, this is by rounds. This was a March Madness a while back when, if you can see the second seed, it's Virginia. This was the year that Virginia was the #1 seed. They lost in the first round to University of Maryland, I think Baltimore County. And the odds given to Virginia to win the first round were 98%. So the other team had a 2% chance of winning. However, they did win. So that's called, so according to the Nate Silver probabilistic viewpoint, the long shot came in. So if you listen, if you read the 538 blogs and you read their articles, it's all about our models predicted this, but something else happened. In fact, they talk extensively about the 2016 election. He gave Hillary Clinton more, or he gave Trump more chance to win than most others, but he still thought that, you know, it was like 80% in the bag for Hillary Clinton. And the election forced all these pundits to go back to the drawing board. Now, this is the superstition of chance dressed up in mathematics. There's no reality here, okay? It was never a 2% chance or a 20% chance or whatever. Now, Richard Feynman said that physics is to mathematics like sex is to masturbation. And if you know anything about Richard Feynman, he was a pickup artist, and he actually talked a lot about picking up women and picking up girls. When he was a professor, he posed as a graduate student in order to pick up girls. But this whole mathematics view is not science. Okay, it is not physics. It is, he would call it masturbation, because there's no reality here. Now, this is another chart from the 538 people, and this is the Seattle Seahawks versus the Patriots. And if you remember, at the very end of the game, the Seahawks had the ball like on the 1 yard line, and then they threw an interception. So you look at these two peaks up here. One is Seattle is on the verge of winning the game. Then they throw the interception, and the probability goes to the bottom, where, you know, now Seattle has very little chance, and then it always ends up at 100, which is the top. Who did win? So what the 538 people do is they are simulating 10,000 simulations at every instant in order to come up with this graph and all these numbers. And I consider this a form of masturbation that has nothing to do with reality. It's certainly not science, because there's no evidence to back this up. The game only happened once. The Patriots won. The whole idea that there was this chance floating around and all these probabilities is just math. It's interesting, and it's sort of fascinating in a way, but it's not reality. Okay, now we're going to move on to some what we'll call hardcore physics. And I'm showing a cover of this book by two fellows named Halliday and Resnick. And I've got a copy here that I was using at one time. And this is about 1,200 pages long, okay? And they have a chapter on entropy and disorder. And you've probably heard that the word nature tends towards disorder, okay? Now, if you deconstruct that, you will see that they define W in this formula called S equals K log W as the disorder parameter. And it's defined, okay, I want you to pay really close attention to this. The probability that the system will exist in the state it is in relative to all the possible states it could be in. So they have exercises saying, go throw some dice, you'll come up with 1 out of 36 for snake eyes. Go shuffle some cards, and you know you get a pattern, and you could have gotten all these. So coulda, shoulda, woulda is built into probability theory, and the whole notion that nature tends towards disorder. And you can tell that there's no physical reality here. You know, the system is in a certain state. The idea that the possible state it could be in is purely theoretical. So let's look at this a little closer. On the left, we have the real world. That's called hard science. That's the state the system is in. And on the right is the unreal world. That's the possible states the system could be in. So, you know, the classic way of looking at probability theory starts with a coin, 1 out of 2, and then you move on to dice, 1 out of 6, and then you talk about cards. And the way to look at cards is how many combinations. It's 52 factorial, 52 times 51 times 50 and all that. So by saying the system could be in a state it is not in, that's counterfactual definiteness. That's built into probability. And it's what I call an immaterial softness. So that's where Mr. Whipple comes in. This is totally just soft thinking. They don't, see, the thing is they don't realize it. That's the problem, okay? It's one thing to say you're doing science, and it's another thing to not realize that you're not doing science, you're doing math. Now, I mentioned T.S. Eliot earlier, and he was a very, very important poet. He won the Nobel Prize in literature, and he is one of the most logical thinkers out there, far more logical than a lot of our scientists, because he realizes that what might have been, so let's just look at what these lines at the bottom, what might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. The scientists take speculation, turn it into a fact, and build an entire edifice around it. And in math, there's a guy named Kolmogorov who basically is said to have put probability theory on a firm foundation. If you go look at his work, he starts talking about coin tosses and 4 equally likely possibilities and saying, here's the experimental proof, which is totally absurd. There's no experimental proof saying you could have gotten something you didn't get. So what we've got here is soft thinking in the hardest of the hard sciences. Okay, so we've already gone through this a little bit, but I want to just point out something at the very bottom, which is a phrase in statistics, which is all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I'm not saying that probabilistic thinking is entirely irrelevant or not useful. It's just that when you think you're getting a random sample, when you think you're pulling marbles out of a hat, that's a very classic illustration in math or in physics. Throw 100 marbles together in a hat with 50 blue and 30 green, and 20 red, and pull one out. What's the probability? That's the model. And if you do that over and over and over, you're going to get a certain pattern. But do it once, it's totally false to say there's evidence that you had a 50% you're getting something that you got. Okay, so I want to move on to quantum predictions because there's a lot of discussion. You'll probably see quantum theory is the most successful theory in the history of science. Quantum theory predictions have never been violated. I mean, if you read anything about quantum theory, you'll see that. The math is not in doubt. Quantum predictions have been tested over and over and over. So there's a fellow named Brian Greene, you probably know who he is. He's written a lot of books, very, very famous scientist. People say he's like, the superstar of physics these days. He may be, but his logic is entirely incorrect. And I'm going to show you why in a second. So he says, physics cannot make definite predictions. That's true. It used to be way back in what they call classical physics. Everybody thought we will know how to predict the future ad infinitum, and that's the end of the story. All you have to do is keep measuring more precisely. And by the way, when they thought that, they also thought we had no free will. Because if you can predict the future, then people don't have free will. So now they're saying we can predict probabilities, that things will turn out one way or another way. And as I just showed you, that's total assumption. It's not science. So here I'm going to show you exactly what's going on. So he says the electron's going around and around, and this is the calculation, the prediction. It's got a 30% chance of being here, 90% chance of being there, 11% chance of being there. And then he goes, crucially, these predictions can be tested. And that is total nonsense, complete nonsense. And he gives himself away by saying, take an enormous sample. So what he's doing, he's taking this experiment, doing it over and over and over. And then he sort of backtracks and says, oh, on any given experiment, it can go here, there, or anywhere else, and that can be tested. Well, that's absurd, okay? Now, it may require a little bit of thought, and obviously Brian Greene has not thought about it enough, but I mean, that's most physicists. He bought into this whole idea without really thinking enough. Now, the whole thing about the long run, this is what is called the long run, enormous sample of identically prepared atoms. Okay. However, he's talking about the prediction. The prediction is the next event happens by probability, 13%, 19%, 11%. Now, one thing I need to mention is in terms of these photons, you probably heard of photons at the quantum level. There's a fellow who, I mean, they can actually do experiments with single photons. But what I want to say was somebody said at any given time, there's about 100 billion photons per second going through a hole 1 square centimeter. So you know how 1 square centimeter is like this much. There's 100 billion photons moving through at any given time. So tracking any one is very, very difficult. But when Greene says, crucially, these predictions can be tested, that is absolutely false. And I actually wrote him. I didn't invite him to be on this, but I wrote him something else a long time ago. I don't expect to hear from him, but I'll debate him at any time. So we're going to get to the actual quantum enigma right now, because I want to simplify this as much as possible. Now, in this book called The Quantum Enigma, the physicists actually give a little bit of leeway to non-physicists. I mean, they've been debating this for 8 decades. And recently somebody said, quantum physics has irked physicists for 100 years. So if you look at this book, it says the Enigma you know, maybe the physicists are not uniquely qualified. You know, we physicists might, you know, okay, I actually forgot to put the end of the quote in here, but we might approach the problem with modesty, though we find that hard. That's what they said. And if you know physicists, they are among the most intellectually arrogant people out there. And online, you will often see which profession is more arrogant. Is it physicists or is it mathematicians? And there's a debate going on. But, you know, over at MIT, math is really a language. It's not considered a science in that sense. But at MIT, physicists reign supreme. Now, in this book, they summarize everything they're saying in this one sentence. It's by considering the experiments we might have done, but in fact did not do, that the quantum enigma arises. So I said that there's one word that basically sums up the solution, and that word is superdeterminism. And superdeterminism says the physicist could not do what the physicist did not do. Or you could not have done what you did not do. So that eliminates the whole coulda, shoulda, woulda. I wish I had done this. I should have done that. Why didn't I do this? You know, why did I do that? So basically, we eliminate the idea that you could have done otherwise, which also looks at the future and says the future is predetermined. And that's what Einstein believed also. Now, this can also be summed up as no free will, okay? The physicist has no free will. And Einstein believed that. Einstein believed there was no free will. And in a very famous interview, a guy named John Bell, who was Bell's inequality, you'll see that, Bell's theorem. He had a discussion with a fellow named Paul Davis about free will. And basically what they said, what the question was, no free will gets us out of the illusion. No free will gets us out of the crisis of quantum theory. So this is what John Bell says. You know, one of the ways of understanding this business is to say that the world is super deterministic. That not only is inanimate nature deterministic, but we, the experimenters who imagine we can choose to do one experiment rather than another, are also determined. If so, the difficulty which this experimental result creates disappears. Free will is an illusion. That gets us out of the crisis, right? And that's what the editor says. And then Bell says, that's correct. It's assumed that free will is genuine. And as a result, one finds that the intervention of the experimenter at one point has to have consequences. But if the physicist was not free, then everything clears up. Okay, then the solution to the quantum enigma is there, which is no free will, which is what Einstein believed. Although he never put those two together. This discussion with John Bell occurred many years after Einstein died. So no free will is the solution to this whole problem of why didn't I do otherwise, and what does tomorrow bring? You know, because no free will means the future is determined. Now that does not mean you walk around in a straitjacket and you have no choice, but we're going to look at that in a second. But when Jim Morrison sang these lyrics, weird scenes inside the gold mine, that's what he's talking about, this gold mine of consciousness. And he has these weird scenes. That's from a song called The End, and I showed that earlier. So the goal of mindfulness is to get to this point of realizing you have no free will. Now this is from Minority Report, the movie, and it sort of summarizes where we are. We're in a very weird place. I'm sorry for whatever I'm going to do, and I swear I didn't do any of that stuff I did. And in Minority Report, Tom Cruise takes one of the precogs into the cyber parlor. And you know, that movie was based short story by Philip K. Dick, who's got all these little stories that have all these intricate twists. And one of them is Paycheck with Ben Affleck. But in this movie, the precogs can sort of see what's going to happen, and then police show up and prevent it from happening. And then these people get locked up, even though they actually never committed a crime. So that's sort of what the physicists are trying to predict the future. I mean, that's really what a lot of people are doing. Weather forecasters, you know, people who go gamble. You're at the racetrack. You're trying to predict the future. The uncertainty principle says you really can't do that. However, that does not mean that it's all left to chance. Chance is totally an assumption. So there is a paradox here. It does not mean you're supposed to give up and go play golf. Now, Dan Dennett here's one of his books. I know this fellow, I've met him a couple times. He's considered one of the world's leading atheists, along with Richard Dawkins. And basically, Dan Dennett, this is Richard Dawkins' book. Dan Dennett says no free will means you're supposed to give up and go play golf, which I find astonishingly simple-minded, especially for a philosopher of his stature. Because no free will does not mean that at all. No free will does not mean you have no choice. You have no ability to choose between alternatives. It simply means that everything's predetermined. Now there is this paradox going on, but that doesn't mean that it's illogical. And giving in, surrendering, is not the same as giving up. Now, if you know quantum theory, once somebody suggested here's a solution to quantum theory, and there's many of those solutions out there. This book was by a guy named John Gribben, and he talks about 6 impossible things, and it's after Alice in Wonderland's, I believe, 6 impossible things before breakfast. He looks at 6 interpretations of quantum theory out of about 15. And one of those 15 is superdeterminism, which somebody said is taken seriously by about 4 physicists in the world. And I can guarantee you the reason why they don't want to take it seriously, superdeterminism, is because it means no free will. And it is a massive blow to the ego to think you have no free will. So you'll see these physicists out there saying, I have to have free will, otherwise science is absurd. And I would say to them, well, if no free will means science is absurd, then what about Einstein? Einstein did science and he did not believe in free will. So don't tell me that your whole world is going to fall to pieces, but that's exactly what's going on. There's a lot of debates out there. Superdeterminism cannot be true. No free will cannot be true because, you know, whatever. And those arguments are completely hollow, okay? Just incredibly hollow. Now, I mentioned the word, or I was going to mention the word crazy because Niels Bohr, one time somebody said, hey, how about this interpretation of quantum theory? And Niels Bohr said, we all know your theory is crazy, but is it crazy enough to be right? And we're not really going to be able to get into the double slit experiment, which is a lot of what's going on here. But no free will is actually sort of a crazy theory within the context of our ability to walk around and seemingly make choices. You know, I got up this morning and I said, okay, am I going to have cornflakes or am I going to have Raisin Bran? And I made a monumental decision to have cornflakes. Or, you know, should I go to this college or should I go to that college? Or should I study for this test or should I not study? You know, all these decisions every day, how could they be predetermined? Somebody said information, there would have to be information out there. Well, I look at information and how it's defined. Claude Shannon, whom I knew, it turns out, one of his sons was my best friend growing up. Claude Shannon is the father of information theory. If you look at how he defines information, I equals zero. Information equals zero. All the information out there amounts to zero, quantitatively, not qualitatively. So anyway, getting back to the upside of no free will, this is what T.S. Eliot said. This is the use of memory for liberation, not less of love, but expanding of love beyond desire, and so liberation from the future as well as the past. So you're sitting here trying to be mindful, trying not to be anxious, trying to be in the moment, trying to be present, trying to have flow, trying to really concentrate on what, trying to stop multitasking, turn off your phone, meditate, go into a retreat. If you know that your future is already predetermined, which, as I said, was what Einstein believed, what Jim Morrison believed, and what Eliot believed, then that gives you this peace of mind. So Eliot, in The Wasteland, he ends his poem with Shanti, 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 the peace that passeth understanding. And he basically, talked a lot about those kinds of things. And I want to see if I can read something from one of his quartets, which is all about here the impossible union of spheres of existence is actual. Here the past and future are conquered and reconciled, where action were otherwise movement of that which is only moved and has in it no sense of movement. The hint half guessed, the hint half understood is incarnation. So he's talking about this union of past and future. And he goes, and right action is freedom from the past and future also. For most of us, this is the end never to be realized. We're only undefeated because we have gone on trying. So right action is a phrase out of Buddhism. And what he's saying is right action is freedom from the past and future. And that's what I'm talking about for, getting to the heart of mindfulness. You understand what right action is, and you are free from the future. Now, if you want to talk about crazy, I'll talk about that all day long. So the way I put it is you have all the free will you need, but maybe not as much as you want. And I know a Christian who gives himself to God every Sunday. But when I talk to him on Monday through Saturday, he says, I have to have free will. Oh yeah, I buy the God thing, but I have to be in control. I have to be in command. So all this stuff about mindfulness being in control is totally the wrong direction, as far as I'm concerned. And you've never been in control. So give up the idea of being in control. And as I said, that does not mean you give in. I mean, that does not mean you give up and you just do whatever you want and go play golf. You are surrendering to a higher power. And that's the other thing. Einstein talked about a higher power, a higher intelligence. The scientists, the last thing they want to accept is a higher power because it is higher than themselves. And if you've never gone to MIT or spent any time there, you would not know what ego is all about in terms of physicists. Okay, a friend of mine, he was talking to some guy who owned a private jet, and this friend of mine has a big ego, and the guy who owns a private jet. So my friend said, "Can I get a ride in your private jet?" And the guy said to him, "Well, I'm not sure your ego would fit." So if you want to see monumental egos, you just have to look around at people who believe they are in control. They are the masters of the universe, the big swinging dicks down on Wall Street who are in control. And if you push towards control, that's going in the opposite direction in terms of understanding what things are really all about. But that doesn't mean you don't feel free, okay? So I just want to say something about, if you go to this website at the bottom, ipne.org/message, I've got this 6-part audio series of this program I gave on the doors a long time ago, which was a one-day seminar that I recorded in front of a live audience. So that's available. It's 40. I'm not sure exactly the price, but you can go to ipne.org/message. And what I want to do now is to open it up to questions and commentary. That was Einstein at the end. Somebody said, you know, give me a smile, and that's what he gave. And I think that's what he would be saying to the physicists out there. You know, and they considered him to be senile, but I think he will have the last laugh. So right before we open it, so this is one of Jim Morrison's big lines. I woke up this morning and I got myself a beer. The future's uncertain and the end is always near. So that's the end is always near is an important part, because if you know mythology and the hero's journey, and that's really what Jim Morrison was all about, the hero's journey, death is always part of life, and there's constant rebirth, living and dying, and you look at the seasons, you look at the way the earth goes around. There's a lot of things about life and death, and we try to avoid death, but if you look at mythology, it's always omnipresent. So if you want to get in touch with me, dshiang@gmail.com, and then you can go to ipne.org/message to see this 6-part audio series that I have there. So why don't we open it up for questions now? So Kevin can, people can raise their hand if they want.
Yeah, no questions. Let's see. You want to go to, do you want to stop sharing and go to a gallery view?
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
All right. Okay, we got loads of people. So anyone wants to ask a question, you can either go through, you got a couple of comments. It's been called dope a couple of times. In a very good way, by the way. Brilliant. So we've had a couple of good comments. No questions. I'll tell you what, I will.
We have a couple questions, actually.
Sure.
So, David, what would you suggest in terms of a practice regarding mindfulness at the start of the day before you go to bed, and a balance of, I'm not in control, but I want to be connecting? DrShaw.com offers the idea of saying, the divine creates and fulfills a new day for me. To say it 4 times, put the hand on the heart before you even open your eyes. I've been doing it for months, and I feel like it helps. Whatever comes, and I've had very close calls, and thinking positively, but staying mostly present.
Yeah, I don't have any specific practice. I mean, I think it's very good to reflect on the day and count your blessings. Be open to what happens, and not be so fearful about the future, not regret so much. I think that's a way to quell your anxieties. I mean, this is obviously a very stressful time, and I'm not going to necessarily eliminate that stress, but I think if we change our attitude, that will really help, and not try to fight so much as to what is really happening. The thing about what might, coulda, shoulda, woulda, that is an omnipresent dilemma, or a lot of us have this, I could have done this, or I should have done that, and that is obviously very nerve-wracking, because if you're always thinking I could have done otherwise, then that is a source of consternation. It's a source of regret. And if you take that away, then you will immediately calm down in a sense.
Okay. I do have a question from Magdalena. In the context of no free will, what is the meaning of action in non-action?
In the context of no free will,
Yeah.
well, I'm not sure about, I mean, I guess it's, if you want to do something, go do it. No free will does not preclude action or say you should act or not act. No free will is simply saying that whatever you choose, you could not have done otherwise.
Okay.
But if Magdalena wants to come on and talk, that's fine.
David,
Yeah.
through intention and visualization, can we create what we choose to experience or the perception thereof each day?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, because people talk about doing these experiments with prayer, or Lynn McTaggart has something about the eight something. I am not going to say that doesn't work. I think nature is very, very subtle. So if somebody visualizes something and it happens, I say that's great. And I'm not going to say that doesn't work. But I think that the idea of a personal God is a very tricky.
I never said God.
Okay, or intent. Well, God is not necessarily somebody up in the sky, but rather, I mean, Einstein talked about God and Spinoza, but so are you asking about does visualization work, or what was your?
Essentially creating our own future by the use of intention.
Yeah, well, I think if we can wrap that into no free will and super determinism, I fully accept that. I mean, you don't know what the future is. That's the other beautiful way it's been set up, that we cannot know the future, no matter how much we try, which is what we want to do. We want to know what's going to happen, but we have uncertainty that's built in. So to say you're creating the future, I would just say that whatever you're creating was predetermined. So that doesn't negate the ability to quote unquote co-create, if that makes any sense. That's the part about weird, Jim Morrison, weird scenes inside the gold mine.
Thank you.
All right, David, may I ask a question?
Sure.
You quoted a lot of interesting scientists tonight and books. Are you familiar with the work of William Tiller, Dr. William Tiller?
Well, yeah, I am. I met him a long time ago, but I don't read him, religiously.
Well, he's a scientist.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, I really consider he's our modern Galileo.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't pretend to understand what you talked about tonight. I think a lot of it is semantics and definition, and quite frankly, being essentially a math teacher. As Richard Feynman said, I guess I'm a masturbator since I'm a math guy. But I find that Dr. Tiller's science, not only his models, but the experiments that he's done to validate them, the 4 experiments in particular, have a lot to do with what you're talking about. And I don't pretend to understand it. I don't really understand most of what you said tonight. I'll confess to that. But I do believe that there's a lot of insight to be made. I just wondered if you had tried to factor in Tiller's model into your philosophy or your concepts.
No, I have not.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Got another question from Sean Gold. Why does the avoidance of my fate cause me to meet my fate? Is it determinism?
Well, that actually brings up Oedipus, okay? And if you know the legend of Oedipus, well, actually, I don't know if the avoidance causes you to meet your fate, but I would say super determinism is the correct way to look at reality. But what I want to say about Oedipus, and I can't see who's saying that question about, don't you be dropping that Oedipus on me. I don't know who said that, but Jim Morrison, in the song The End, he screamed out, "Father, I want to kill you. Mother, I want to blank." And a lot of people say that's Jim Morrison's Oedipus complex coming out. He's a rebel, he's a bad boy. He's saying this to violate a taboo, which is totally absurd. But anyway, in the legend of Oedipus, he grew up with foster parents because his parents tried to have him killed. Because his father, it turns out, was the world's first pederast in legend. So his father raped a young boy named Chrysippus, and Chrysippus's father put a curse on Laius, who was Oedipus's father, and said, "If you have a son, that son's going to kill you." So Oedipus's father tried to avoid having any children, and one night he got drunk, and then 9 months later, his wife had a son. Okay? And this is all in the legend, but it's actually very interesting. So Oedipus grew up as a foster child because his parents tried to have him killed, so the legend would not be fulfilled. The prophecy, the curse would not be fulfilled. So then Oedipus goes, he's way off being brought up by foster parents, and he thinks they're his real parents. And somebody says, "You're not, your parents are not these people. They're your step parents." And Oedipus is very upset. So he goes to the Greek oracle. And the Greek oracle, he says, "Who are my parents?" And the Greek oracle says, "You are fated to kill your father and marry your mother." And so he goes off in the other direction, away from his foster parents. And on the way, going in the opposite direction, he meets his real father. Of course, he doesn't know it, and he kills him because they get into an argument. And then he meets the Sphinx, and nobody could solve the riddle of the Sphinx until Oedipus came along. And the riddle was, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? And Oedipus, who's considered extremely intelligent, answered man, because he's on all 4s. He crawls in the morning, he walks upright in the noon, and in the evening he's with a cane. So the Sphinx kills herself, and then as a reward, the queen, whose husband has died, Oedipus killed him by accident, as a reward for killing the Sphinx, he gets the hand of the queen. And of course, the oracle's prophecy is fulfilled. So anyway, Freud made a huge deal out of this and came up with the Oedipus complex. And he also fancied himself as an Oedipus, solver of the riddle of the Sphinx. So when Jim Morrison was singing The End, I mean, he actually talked a lot about psychoanalysis and Greek tragedy with critics and even, with his bandmates. And he talked a lot about the Oedipus riddle. But what Morrison's saying in that song, when he screams out, "Father, I want to kill you," he's basically saying, "I am Oedipus, I've solved the riddle of the Sphinx." And he's using Freud to get to Sophocles. And I'll just mention one other thing about that song, which is very complex, no pun intended. But there's a line in there. There are 3 lines. The killer awoke before dawn. He put his boots on. He took a face from the ancient gallery, and he walked on down the hall. And at that point in the song, when the killer awoke before dawn, he's bringing up Greek tragedy because at the city festival of Dionysus, the Athenians would come and camp out on a hillside and watch all these plays over the course of several days. And all the tragedies began at dawn. Then he goes, the killer, he put his boots on. So the principal actors wore these buskins, which are boots, to elevate themselves above the regular actors. And then he took a face from the ancient gallery and he walked down the hall. So now, at this point, the killer who awoke before dawn, he's putting on a mask. And at that point in the song, Jim Morrison, he's gone from the first person to the third person, and he's also started talking or reciting as opposed to singing. So he's using all these distancing devices to make it clear this is not Jim Morrison screaming out, Jim Morrison first person, Father, I want to kill you. He's got a mask on. So he has assumed the Oedipus, but he's using Freud. So anyway, that's sort of a long answer to the fate, but fate, if you look at fate and destiny, those words are very scary to a lot of people because it implies that you are not in control. And that's exactly what superdeterminism says. And that's one reason why physicists hate superdeterminism.
Okay. I have a question that actually came up earlier and I missed it. So from Arcana Tebek, is the analogy, he wants you to know your opinion on this analogy. Concept of determinism as perfectly explainable by mathematics, probability, concept of determinism as predictable by probabilities. Wants to know how you'd answer this analogy.
Determinism is explainable by mathematics.
Determinism as perfectly explainable by mathematics, and probability concept of determinism as predictable by probabilities.
Okay, the question is from Anand. He's coming over.
Okay.
He's the math guy.
Fantastic.
Hi, sorry.
It's a little over my head.
So the idea is you were saying how previously mathematicians and physicists thought that everything could be perfectly explainable mathematically, and now they think that they can predict probabilities of what those outcomes will be. So the question is sort of probability as in a relation to the previous idea that mathematics could be determined. What then is related back to probability, if that makes sense? So there's probability, sort of the iteration that people now believe is the best way to figure out determinism.
Well, I think physicists have largely abandoned the idea of determinism. Okay, that's sort of a fact. What happened was with classical physics, they said, okay, all we have to do is keep measuring and measuring and measuring, and we will be able to predict the future. So there's no free will, and some people got upset, but nobody really thought about it. What happened was they kept measuring, and they came up with Planck's constant, and they found they could not measure beyond a certain point. And then they said, well, gee, we can't measure beyond it, but we have to measure something. We have to predict something. So we'll predict using probabilities. We'll say that the coin can go either heads or tails. And see, in the long run, it's 50% heads and 50% tails. So we'll take the long run and smear it out to the individual, and we'll do 50-50. Now, that is completely unscientific because you cannot test that. You toss a coin, you got a heads, and the idea you could have gotten tails is pure hypothesis, pure assumption, pure contrafactual definiteness. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but what I said in my book is that physicists want to predict. That was the whole, in fact, they said the aim of quantum mechanics is to predict the future. So when they said, oh my God, Planck's constant is here, we can no longer predict the future, we need to predict something. So let's use probability. Now that, it turns out that's math, not science.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a couple questions for you, David.
Mhm.
I was talking to a neuroscientist, and we were talking about almost energetic type of things. And I was saying, there's, it brings up coincidences, like when you're thinking of someone calls you. And this neuroscientist out of MIT, by the way, said there is no such thing as coincidences. No, he says there's only, no, he didn't say there's no such thing. He says there's only coincidences. There's no such thing as any, anything but randomness. What's your thoughts on that answer?
There's only randomness?
Yeah. He was saying basically the things I was talking about were only coincidences. There were nothing more.
Well, I mean, he can believe that if he wants. I totally reject that.
Okay, how does that fit in? Because he was basically saying randomness. How does that fit into what you've been talking about when it comes to energy work or something like that, where you're thinking of somebody and somebody calls you and things like that?
Well, I would say that's part of. I would use the term synchronicity.
Synchronicity.
I mean, I'll give you an example. I was going to Hong Kong, and so I called up this friend of mine who lives in Hong Kong, and he said, "Well, I'm going to be out of." I said, "I'm going to be there this weekend. Some weekend. I'm going to be out of town, and so we can't get together." So then, okay, so I went to Hong Kong, and then we were there for like a couple of weeks, and we decided to Thailand. So we get to Thailand. And we get on this tour bus, and this guy is on this tour bus with his wife. Because she lived in a different country, they decided to meet in Thailand for that weekend. So he wasn't in Hong Kong. So is that randomness, or is that something else? I would say that is not a random thing. That is a predetermined thing. That shows an order in the universe, as opposed to a disorder and randomness. So
I like that.
It's a way of looking at the world. I mean, somebody can believe that it's all random if they want. I just don't accept that.
Okay. One more question for me. Tom earlier was talking about intentions, visualization, and stuff. Well, I do a lot of work where we kind of make intentions of some sort, and there's a lot of it coming true. I mean, a lot more than we're talking about coincidences. When you start off, one thing works, it's a coincidence. 2 or 3 things work within a short period of time, it's much more than a coincidence. My logic here actually involves another rock star, same era, okay, who was a wise philosopher in himself. I say that kiddingly. But sometimes we're working for something and we have a specific thing in mind. That specific thing doesn't happen, but something even better happens. I quote, of course, Mick Jagger, "You don't always get what you want, you get what you need." Do you see this thing of no free will actually kind of working that way?
You mean want versus need?
Yeah. Basically, the things that happen are happening for the good and around the area that people are working on, but they're not getting exactly what they want. But they are finding out they're getting what they need. They're working on relationships. All of a sudden, a relationship that they didn't care about gets fixed, and now they care about it, and now it's good, but it isn't what they wanted. You see what I mean?
Well, I think that's a tricky, want and need. I mean, in this coronavirus, people are dying left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to say that's a good thing. That's part of a big plan out there, and we have to accept it. So if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, you know, this whole thing about free will, people have been debating this for thousands of years, and I'm saying there is a solution to that. Most people would say this debate will continue. I mean, yeah, I'm not going to say people are going to accept what I'm saying, and I'm not like a Mormon who's going to knock on your door and try to convert you. That's not my intention. I'm just putting out there what I've gone through and what other people are saying. So want versus need is I'd say that's a little tricky. But as far as you know, I don't think anybody wants to get sick from coronavirus or needs it, but it's happening.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? By the way, before I forget, I want to thank Catherine Payton. Hopefully, she has been putting notes of your talk throughout the entire thing. So I will be able to capture them, and I will be able to have them afterwards as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Catherine. All right, any other questions?
Yes, okay, Kevin, this is Anil. Okay, can I ask a small question?
You sure can, Anil.
Sure.
Okay, okay, David, I practice Hindu astrology. I'm a Hindu. You know, so they say, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, it says, okay, what is the difference between free will and determinist? It means if you have a free will, it really takes you where you are supposed to go.
Free will takes
Like
you where
you
you're
have a free
supposed to.
will. I mean, yes, I mean, it's already determined, you know, okay, where you are supposed to go. So you say you have the free will. Yes, you have the free will, but the free will is actually taking a deterministic form that, okay, you were supposed to do that, so you did it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm not sure I quite understand that, but
like say, I mean, okay, like so people say, okay, you don't have I mean, you have a free will, but when you have a free will, whatever you do, it is supposed to where you were supposed to go anyway, you know. So I mean, that was already determined that you have to do that.
Okay. I would sort of put it a slightly different way in terms of Einstein believed in law and order. We saw that, you know, he did not believe in randomness and probability and chance. If you know the I Ching, the Chinese Book of Changes, it's like an ancient divination treatise, and you're supposed to throw coins or yarrow sticks. And a lot of people say, oh, you're supposed to throw a coin, say, 6 times. And that has to do with the trigrams in the Bagua. In Chinese philosophy, there's something called the Bagua. That actually was the first binary system, on or off. But in terms of the throwing of the coins, the whole point, and I'll show you these trigrams. Okay, this is from the I Ching. The whole point of interpreting when you throw a coin is if you take this coin and you toss it and you get a head, that's what you were supposed to get. So I think when you're talking about that, this also applies to people. So when you do something, that's what you're supposed to be doing.
Exactly, that's what I meant.
So you were supposed to be where you are. And a lot of people, they fight where they are. They're, oh my God, I'm just so unhappy because I'm in this miserable situation. Now that does not mean that there are people on death row who are not supposed to be there. They're innocent, you know. But I mean, that's called fate. And Einstein, you know, people said, oh, how can you not believe in free will? You know, I mean, what about this mass murderer? Was this mass murderer destined to be a mass murderer? And Einstein said, yes, the mass murderer was destined to be a mass murderer, but I don't want to sit next to him at dinner. You know, so I mean, so Einstein would probably go watch The Silence of the Lambs and say, yeah, Hannibal Lecter, what a killer, but you know, he was designed to be a killer. I mean, nobody said God was totally great. You know, God, I mean, it depends what you mean by great, but I mean, nobody said, well, people talk about a benevolent God, and you know, somebody said, well, if there was a benevolent God, then why do people have varicose veins? I mean, they picked on something so trivial, you know, as opposed to why was there Hitler? You know, yes, there was Hitler. God or Spinoza, you know, Spinoza's God, the order of the universe, whatever it is, pantheism allowed Hitler to do what he did. That does not mean we're supposed to just allow it to happen again. I mean, that's why, you know, people are out there protesting. It's like, I don't sit back and go play golf. That's Dan Dennett, you know, no free will means you go play golf. I mean, to me, that's just, I'm a little surprised at Dan for saying that, because I know him and I've read his work, and you know, it's just so simple-minded. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. That answers my question.
Sure. I did want to just, you know, since we talked about Jim Morrison, we haven't really gone deep into the Doors, but I do want to mention that one song that I quoted a little bit called The Wasp, and it's called Texas Radio and the Big B. And he goes, I want to tell you about Texas Radio and the Big B. Comes out of the Virginia swamps, cool and slow, with plenty of precision, with a backbeat narrow and hard to master. I love the friends I've gathered together with this thin raft. We have constructed pyramids in honor of our escaping. This is the land where the Pharaoh died. And out here on the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stone immaculate. So their music and that song, and you know, even though he didn't write Light My Fire, that's a big song. The End, When the Music's Over, those songs have incredible emotion behind them. And they, in my view, I mean, he literally said, dance on fire as it intends. So he's saying, listen to my music. My music intends for you to dance on fire. And if you can find liberation through that, that's what he wants. That's why he said, you know, there are things known and things unknown, and in between are the doors. And he, you know, talking about Aldous Huxley and doors of perception. And he lived for his art. That's very, very clear.
All right. Well, thank you, David. I think we're just about out of time. We're a couple of minutes over the half hour. This has been great. I thank you very much. We had a lot of interaction, which means that you spurred a lot of ideas, and that's what you wanted to do, correct? We had a lot of great questions, and this has been great. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. If you're not a part of the meetup and you want to become a part of the meetup, just get on meetup.com to look for a Greater Boston NLP and Hypnosis meetup. I will have the recording out in a couple days, as well as I've captured all the notes. And so I'm going to have all the notes that Catherine had, and they're basically going to be a summary of your talk, which is great, but we'll have the entire recording as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.